Hey, my name is Joey. Welcome to my podcast, Leadership in Tough Places. I've developed this podcast especially for Christian leaders who are leading in difficult climates or environments, and really hope that this enhances your leadership. And today, I'm beginning a 4-part leadership talk about winning in the city. So this podcast, specifically, the next 4 parts are specific to those who are leading in difficult environments like the city. I'm calling this talk Urbanomics. Urbanomics, winning in the city. I actually taught this in whole at a conference, and I'm going to break it up into 4 parts so it's more palatable. So let's begin with part 1, Urbanomics, winning in the city, part 1. And I can't do that unless I start with our story. And I'll really condense this, but our story is this. My wife and I moved into Philadelphia, into the city, November 1st, 2013. Had a vision and a dream to plant and start the Block Church, and we didn't know it was going to be called the Block Church at that time. We actually didn't understand funding or church planning models or any of that stuff. I just thought you saved money and then you moved to the city or moved to wherever you were going to go, and then you had to keep raising money and meet people. I didn't understand there were other ways of resourcing and borrowing and stuff like that. So we kind of did it old school. We moved into the city. No one would rent us a place. No one would sell us a place because we didn't have W-2s. And so right on the top, right off the top, all the money that we had saved for the past year and a half to move and to plant, we had to basically give 9 months, 6 months of rent, and then first, last, and security right up top. No one would rent us, and one guy said, if you give me 9 months, then the place is yours. And it was a little place in South Philly, but it had a living room that was larger than most other row homes. And I felt like this is where we were going to start our church. And so that's kind of how we began the journey of planting. We basically went all in with our faith. And we started basically, I basically told my wife, hey, today's November 1st. We are going to start our church in January. So let's enjoy December, which kind of brings me to my first point, if you will. Here's number 1, Urbanomics, winning in the city. The first thing that we did, now this is our perspective, this is my perspective, but the first thing we did is we consumed the culture. We consumed the culture. What I mean by that is we took the month of December, and really before we ever went public, we did public services in September of 2014. So we were basically on the ground for over 9 months. We consumed the culture. We lived and we breathed the culture before we did anything, before we named our church, before we decided what we would be about. We went and we breathed it in. We went to the coffee shops. We went to the restaurants. We went and consumed the culture. We understood the gastropub culture. We understood the way that the city was set up and the way that the streets were set up. We understood that you said a name, and then you said this, and then you said east, and then you said everything about our city that we needed to know, how we needed to speak the language of the city. We went and we consumed that before we ever named the church, before we ever picked a place, before we ever even recruited people. We started to consume the culture. I wanted to know exactly what we were getting into, and I wanted to leave room for God to speak. So for us, that's what we did. We consumed the culture. Here's the second thing. Once you consume the culture, you should define the mission. Define the mission. So it wasn't till months later that we had been on the ground. We were visiting the restaurants, the coffee shops, meeting the people, going to the games. Of course, I had a baseline of understanding for Philadelphia, originally from there. However, moved to Orlando, Florida when I was young. That's where we met Christ. And so while I had a baseline of understanding of the city and of the people, there were a lot of gaps and a lot of missing years. And so as we consumed the culture, then we were able to define the mission. We sat around. I remember specifically as we were defining the mission, I remember specifically sitting around we wanted to get into a hotel room that like had views, and we wanted to sit there and we wanted to dream. And we were asking the Holy Spirit, what was he saying to us? What was he breathing into us? What did we learn over those couple months of consuming the culture? And it just kept coming back to this phrase, revive every block. Now, of course, that's what we call it now. That's what our mission is now. Originally, it was one block at a time, but the lane and the language was block by block. How we got there and how we were able to define the mission was we understood the culture. For instance, the way that Philadelphia was built and was set up was that it was parish models. Depending on what neighborhood you lived in or what tribe you were a part of, if you were a part of the Irish group of people, well, you went to the Irish Catholic Church on this street, and that meant you lived on these blocks, and that meant this was your background. And so we kind of took that concept of parish model, neighborhood model, block by block, and we said the kind of church that we feel like we're meant to build is a multi-site church that is block by block. We're going to start in whatever neighborhood will open up to us, which that's a whole other story for a whole different day. But we're going to start in that neighborhood, and then as we get to a particular critical mass, we're then going to separate and go to the next neighborhood based on the amount of people or the percentage of people from the next neighborhood. So we allowed the church and the growth to pick where we were going next, or at least we did in theory. So we consumed the culture, then we defined the mission. After we defined the mission, and this is the last part of part one, is we started and now we always tell the story of our brand. Okay, so what you can see right now is our original logo, which is kind of funny looking back on it. And then now the next photo that you can see is all of our brands on one. And you can see how it's evolved. So we started with one picture, one idea, and then it turned into here is now our logo. And here is all the brands that came from the original logo. You can see that we invest heavily into our Instagram and our YouTube and the different ways that we can tell the story of our brand at the Block Church. That's really all of our handles for our church. And why I say that you should start and always tell the story of your brand is because in cities particular, you are competing with all sorts of things and people and shops, and you are anywhere. And everyone's, of course, always seeing things. There's constant stimulation in cities. But what stands out to people, and I think this is true across the board, but what's going to stand out to people is a compelling story, particularly in our cities that are post-Christian and that in a lot of ways are very anti-Christ. We feel like to win in the city, to speak the language of the city, we are telling stories constantly, and our brand is part of that story, stories of life change, of transformation, and we're tying it into the fabric. We're weaving it into the fabric of our city's story. Our brand, it represents our city. Our stories represent our brand, and both of them enhance our city. That is what pulls people in. And so we're always telling the story. We started to tell the story as we gained people, and then we're always telling the story of our brand. So that's part one of Urbanomics, Winning in the City. I hope it was helpful, and I hope you come back for part two. Remember, this podcast is for leaders who are leading in tough places, and if that's you, I'd love for you to like, I'd love for you to subscribe, I'd love you to be a part of this leadership conversation. Thanks, and we'll see you for part two.